survive the storm without too much disruption. We had some disruption, some electrical outages and stuff. Anyway, that was part of the reason why I forgot to post or didn't get around to posting the reading questions for today. So we won't be meeting on Thursday because I'll be going to another conference, or back-to-back conferences, like a crazy person. But so I won't be in town on Thursday. What I'll do is I'll post the reading questions as like a short essay type thing on Canvas, and then so you can take it or not as you would normally do. So it'll be like what would otherwise have been today's reading questions. So they'll count towards your aggregate grade for the reading questions as normally. And then after this, we'll be back on our regular schedule again. That'll be the last time we'll have to cancel anything. All right. So last time we left off with the beginning of Altman and Wellman's discussion on international criminal law. And hopefully we're a little behind. We can get to their views on intervention and assassination today. If not, we'll get into that next time. But we'll catch up. So the basic framework why they're talking about international criminal law right before they start talking about intervention is because there's this sort of shared problem. Right? The shared problem is if you look at these questions against the background or through the lens of the traditional international law system, which is a system of non-intervention, sovereign states, each with the right to take care of their own self-regarding affairs. If that's how you look at it, then international criminal law becomes a big problematic thing, right? Because international criminal law includes international bodies or tribunals made up of judges out of different other countries holding people from some other country criminally liable. Right? So judging them, punishing them, and so on. And it starts with the Nuremberg trials. That's the first big moment where you see that happening in history. Before that, you had war, and then you get to this type of victor's justice, right? Where the winners tell the losers they don't punish them, right? They don't have a trial with evidence and lawyers and then a prison sentence or whatever. They line them up against a wall and they shoot them, right? Or they let them go home. That's more or less maybe they strip your military credentials or something. That's it. And so Nuremberg is a big shift in that. It's no longer this sort of among elites, war is just a thing that happens, and you win or you lose, but then you deal with it, and if you lose, it might cost your life, but that's just part of the game, so to speak. And it turns into, no, this is not a game we're playing. There are rules here, and there are rights here, and these are not just the rights of the elites amongst each other, but they include the rights of the people that the elites are governing over or bossing around, and so on. And if you violate these rights badly, really badly, like a big-time criminal would, then we're going to judge you and treat you as if you were a big-time criminal. That's roughly what's happening. And that's a very different way of thinking about war. And so. It's also a very different way of thinking about international affairs, right? Because these are international crimes against humanity and so on, are going to be crimes that can happen within a certain country. And traditionally, that stuff was off limits, was out of bounds, because international law only dealt with interactions between countries. And so as long as you minded your own business, those were your own affairs. None of any other country had any authority or standing or right to deal with that. And so all that goes out with the Nuremberg trials. And so there's several versions of the problem. The first problem is this idea of standing, right? Like, why do outsiders have the standing, even the sort of the authority that you might require to punish? The second is the rights question. How about the sovereignty that's involved? And then there's a third one that we'll get to in a little bit. There's a worry about ex post punishment, but we'll get to that now. So first, how might this be justified, if at all? Right? This is a good idea. Well, if it is, you better have a good story to tell, good justification. And so the first argument that Altman and Wellman consider is an argument about this standing question. How come outsiders might have the standing or the authority to do this? And one possible suggestion is to say, well, crimes against humanity, why do we call them crimes against humanity? Anyone, any suggestions or thoughts? Why is genocide a crime against humanity? Michael? That's true, yeah, the crimes that infringe on the rights of humans, of course, if I come and I slap you, right, then I've infringed on your rights, and you're a human, so right? Fundamental rights, so if I do something worse than stabbing you, maybe like slapping you or stab you or something with that, is that a crime against humanity? Yeah. Maybe, right? Yeah. They wouldn't be classified internationally, right? But that's a good question you're asking. Maybe it should. But Tarkovian?
Yes. Maybe because it's a large group of people and the population of certain ethnicity.
Yeah, good. So those usually are the crimes against humanity. Those are the crimes that are classified as crimes against humanity. So like genocide or ethnic cleansing, large-scale displacement, things like that. So why are they not just ordinary crimes like slapping someone or stabbing them, but crimes against humanity?
Because the crimes affect people well outside of the group that's directly affected by it. For instance, in a genocide, you might deny future generations access to any kind of cultural heritage and stuff like that. With, for instance, with Native Americans, past a certain point, it's incredibly difficult for someone to really get an idea of what happened in their family's lineage and everything, just because that's been completely wiped out. So even though the crime itself is already over, its consequences are still impacting people outside of the original group.
Right, good. Yeah, so there might be some type of broader negative effect that happens because of the crime, so like the whole group's cultural heritage might be destroyed and so on. Right? That's interesting. So, but of course, humanity is not just is bigger than just even a group, right? Even a very big group. So, why would we call it not just crimes against the group, but crimes against humanity?
Well, like I said, because the consequences extend outside of the group itself. Like the group itself receives the brunt of the negative impact of the crime, but the crime itself can reach around the globe or, well into other countries, other nations, other groups of people.
Yeah, maybe. Interesting. Good. Yeah, so one slightly, maybe a version of this, but a slightly, like a variation on this idea is the one that, it's the first one that Altman and Wellman discuss. It's a suggestion that comes from Hannah Arendt when she describes the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Basically like this, is this, like there's something about these international crimes, like crimes against humanity, but that makes them crimes against everybody. So it's not just a person who gets stabbed, who gets displaced, or who gets shot, or whatever it is, right? Who's partly harmed as a result of a genocide or displacement or whatever. That is against whom the crime is committed, but it's also you and me. And then, of course, you can go through, right? So if something is a crime against you and me or anyone, right, then you or your representatives, anyone's representatives, have standing to punish that crime, and then so you can go through, right? And therefore, international bodies, if we correctly appoint them as our representatives, then they have standing to punish that crime. The key premise here, of course, is this first one, right? Like, they're really crimes against everybody. That's the one we were just talking about. Like, why would that be the case? Arendt suggests something like this. Arendt thinks that when the Holocaust happened, for example, there was something so dehumanizing about that. There was something about treating Jewish people as literally subhuman, rats, and so on. Those used to be the words that they were invoked to describe Jews by the Nazis around those times. That they're sort of taken down from humanity, and that sort of devalues our standing as humans, all of us. And so there was something about our shared humanity that we have, some value that we have, that if you recognize a person as a human, then you must recognize them as someone with human rights, something like that. That thing is being attacked. It's not just the killing, that's bad enough as it is, of course. It's not to say that the killing isn't so bad anymore. That's as bad. But there's some extra layer. That's why genocide, if 1,000 people get killed in a genocide, it's as bad for those 1,000 people as if 1,000 random people get killed in a year. But there's an additional layer with the genocide that shocks us even more, and that additional layer is that it's an attack on the humanity of people around the world. Arendt took that quite seriously. Arendt thought, for example, that Eichmann was, the trial of Eichmann is, I think, in the late 50s. The Israeli Secret Service, he was hiding in Argentina, the Israeli Secret Service went into Argentina, snatched him off the street, basically, and then took him to Jerusalem, and then he stood trial there. Eichmann was probably one of the leading bureaucrats in the Holocaust. So he was the person who organized all the train transports, all the transportation. One of the reasons why the Germans started gassing Jewish people was the original plan was to just ship them all eastwards. You could just get them all into Ukraine, Russia, and so on. Just get rid of them that way, right? Romania and so on. But of course, there's hundreds of thousands, millions of Jewish people at that time in Europe, and that's just not to be too blunt about it, but it's a gigantic logistical problem, right? If you're going to move millions of people out of Europe, it's a hell of a job to organize, right? You need to get all the trains, you need to get everyone at the trains in time, you need these trains running, you need to disperse them. It's just logistically enormous amount of work. So Eichmann, actually, that was what he spent most of his time doing, was organizing this part. Then they started gassing them because that was easier than just displacing. But then still, you have to get them all to these concentration camps and then disperse them to these destruction camps and so on. So that was what he did. And so the Israeli government snatches Eichmann and says, you were such an important part of the crime against these Jewish people that you're going to stand trial now. And they and some of the people who were living in Israel at the time thought it was correct, appropriate, that Eichmann would be standing trial in Jerusalem, in Israel, which had just been founded at that point, because the crime was so directed against the Jews that it would be good that the Jews would stand in trial, like in judgment. And Arendt, who herself was Jewish German at the time, she was against this. So she thought it would have been better if this had been a truly international court because of this crimes against everyone idea. It wasn't just a crime against the people who were actually being gassed and taken away to concentration camps. It wasn't just a crime against Jewish people all over the world. It was a crime against everybody. And if that's right, then she thought, actually, it's not just that international bodies have the standing to do it, but really only international bodies have the standing to do it, or the most standing, maybe. They really appropriately express that it is against everyone. All right. It might also tell you why the second worry. The second worry, if you remember, was the worry about the sovereignty rights. You might think, well, we'll get to this in the next slide. If it attacks everywhere, then it seems to be an international crime, a crime that cuts across borders as well. So here's what Altman and Wellman think about this. They don't like this argument very much. So their theory is a different theory about why crimes against humanity can be punished by international bodies. They think this is a pretty obscure idea, that it's really a crime against everybody. It sounds sort of lofty and deep, maybe highfalutin, but they don't really understand what it means. They think if there's... In Syria right now, there are so-called crimes against humanity going on. But that would mean that you right now are being violated, like in some sense, right? In some sense, you are being attacked. They say, well, is that true? So, I don't feel it, right? They can't really make sense of it in anything else than metaphorical terms. You don't really see how their rights or how their standing is any less secure by what's going on in Syria. Those people are being extremely vulnerable, but are we? Well, if they are crimes against everyone, then there have to be crimes against us, and that's not. So they think it's probably false, actually, and in any case, hard to make sense of. So then this is going to be not really working very well, and they think, well, the argument is really misguided anyway, because even if we could make sense of certain crimes being attacks on you and me, everyone else around the world, that's really not. We're looking in the wrong place to think. Well, what if something really bad happened? Like a genocide, but just slightly different, like a mass displacement or something. Right? Well, would that have to affect everyone before we could say that it would be okay for international courts to hold these people into, put these people on trial? Do we really have to go through all the workings to show, well, actually, this is the way in which everyone is being attacked? No, I think that the fact that it's really bad, that's important enough. That's reason enough. That's ultimately their theory. They have a very simple theory. They say, well, when do you get to punish people for crimes against humanity? When they're really bad. That's basically the idea. Jacobi?
Do you think that the creation of international crime international criminal court,
Yeah.
was that created to, I guess, make people care about conflicts that are happening across cities in other countries, maybe?
Yes. The short answer is yes. Yeah. We'll get to that in a little while, but there's this. Here's the worry, right? If you have, before the International Criminal Court and the Nuremberg trials happened, the standing legal rule was whatever you do within your own country is the affairs of the people and the government. Right? And the worry is, well, that gives a lot of freedom to sort of dictators and tyrants to just abuse their people, right? If it's just the affairs of the government and the people, and the government is abusing the people, then the theory is, well, the people will get rid of the government, right? But this means the government only has one party to fear, which is its own people. Right? So if you're in power, what are you going to do? You're going to really cramp down on these, get pretty hot, pretty violent and brutal. Throw people in prison, make them disappear, torture them, whatever, right? Like really threaten them as much, so nobody will stand up against you, because you don't have to worry about anything from the outside. And so the human rights movement was an attempt to start having some type of legal body that would cut against this, right? Where you say, no, there are rules outside of what happens within your country that we can hold you to. International Criminal Court was the idea to have a court that attaches to things like the human rights law or the crimes against humanity international law, so that it's not just words on paper, but there's actually some enforcement going on. And so now these people have to at least start thinking a moment, because if they start really abusing their own people, they might be taken to the International Criminal Court that says, and you're going to jail for that.
Depending on if the country actually tries to act.
Right. Yes, of course. And that's, of course, in practice, that's questionable. Sometimes they do. So often when they do, they often do it much later. Right? They very rarely manage to go in at the time and stop and take. But they have. So a number of the war criminals from the Yugoslavian civil war in the 1990s have been taken to the International Criminal Court and stood trial, including Milosevic, who was the head of the Serbian government at that time. He died in prison at the International Criminal Court. A natural death, but still. He was in the process of being judged. And so, yeah, soldiers showed up, picked him up, and took him to jail. That's what happened. Jeff.
So the International Criminal Court, do they have the right to go into a country and snatch somebody up?
So the International Criminal Court itself doesn't have troops that it can use, it would have to be UN troops of some sort or some other internationally sanctioned.
But they'll do that.
They can, yeah. It's tricky. Often it will go with the consent of the home country, right? So these people might live sort of in the shadows, if you will. And so the government might say, yeah, you can go in. But yeah, I mean, we know these things, right? Bin Laden was killed in a way without knowledge on the home government. That wasn't even by the internet. That was just the U.S. government going.
Yeah, that was.
Eichmann himself was taken by the Mossad in Argentina without the Argentinian government being notified as well.
But
so yeah,
can the International Criminal Court be like, hey, United Nations or EU or whoever, somebody, go get these people? Is that a thing they do?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah. And they won't. And most of the time they don't, because most of the time either they don't know where they are, or they're in cahoots with the local government, which means if you go in, it'll be treated like an invasion or something, right? Or they'll be like hold-ups in like fortified things that you have to have a mini war to get them out. So like there's all sorts of things that might get in the way, but in principle, that's possible. Yeah, in some cases that's possible. Yeah. And again, the idea is to have these people now have to think twice about what they do, right? And You can't just sort of massacre your own people anymore without fear of repercussions down the line. All right. So that was a standing question. How come you have standing? Well, one idea is that it's a crime against everyone, and so then we can appoint these people as our judges. But Altman and Wellman don't really think that's the good argument because they think that's not what you need to show for this to be okay. Just that it's bad enough can be enough reason. So here's the second one, right? So how come we can go into another country and violate what would normally seem its rights to sovereignty or self-determination, right? So the U.S. goes into Pakistan to kill bin Laden. Well, Pakistan is a sovereign nation that has a right against intervention or something. Then you can't just send military troops inside its borders. That's an attack. So how come that when we start doing these things, judging people in the International Criminal Court or interventions or something in between, like an assassination case, like the bin Laden case, how come that you have the right, or you can sometimes maybe have the right to do that? Can you? Right? So one answer here is again to say like, well, maybe these international crimes or crimes against humanity are really, they're acts of aggression already. So the old model is international law only starts kicking in when one country attacks another, right? Does something that spills over the borders or something. So one possibility of why you might go in and punish these people is because those people have attacked another country. They just started a war of some sort. And so maybe these international crimes are really like attacking another country, just in a different form. So Justice Jackson, who was the Chief Justice of the Nuremberg trials, he gave this argument. Right? So and this is in 1946. That was very much, they were still dealing with that old idea of international law. And he said, why can we punish these Nazi officials, who were political officials, by the way, right? Most of them weren't part of the military, and yet in Nazi Germany, you had a big separation between the military and the Nazi party apparatus. And they were separate. The military helped out, but they were separate groups. So many of the Nazi officials were not themselves generals or something. They were politicians. So they were being held to criminal account. Why? Well, Jackson said, well, the war part, which is done by the military, and what these Nazis were doing with the Holocaust, that was really not two separate things, where you were fighting a war with one branch of the government and doing the Holocaust with another, and you could have done the Holocaust without the war and the war without the Holocaust. He said, no, these are really intertwined. It was one big sort of assault on Europe and Jewish people around. It's like, and really one integrated, intimate whole. And that means that if there's all part of one big whole, and the whole is aggressive, well, then the parts are aggressive too. That's basically the idea. And so if the whole is punishable under international law, then the parts are punishable under international law. And so there's a philosopher at Vanderbilt called Larry May who has written a book called The International Harm Principle, and he thinks that's basically the philosophical treatment of that. He thinks it's kind of these crimes that we're talking about, like genocide, they often spill across the borders. They destabilize entire regions. You get refugees pouring over the borders into other countries, and then they have these big refugee camps that are full of usually armed individuals or military groups, paramilitary groups, and they destabilize those countries. And so it's not an intentional attack, but it has all the effects of it. So you have violence is going to spill across the region, and there you have your aggression. All right, so here's the roughly May's argument, right? So international crimes, they actually harm international society or the peace among nations. If something attacks that international society or the peace among nations, then it affects other sovereign states. So international crimes affect other sovereign states. And then here to complete it, right? If that happens, then you can have punishment under old-fashioned international law because it has that international dimension. And there's your answer, right? So why can we punish someone like the people who ran, say, the Rwandan genocide? Why would that be okay? Well, because in the Rwandan genocide, all these people flowing into the northern Congo, that affected the stability and peace in that part of Africa. It's when those things happen, then you have an international dimension. International law is supposed to stabilize international society, oppose or allow us to enforce the stability. And this violated that, so you can use international law to punish these people. That's the argument. All right. So, the question, is this true? Is it true that international crimes harm like the peace among nations or international society and so on?
Dependent on the situation. I mean, like you said, genocide is, see that as a crime against humanity, but it's internal and you're not wiping people out, you're just mean, you know.
Really mean?
Like a really unfair judicial system, something like that, a horrible place, kind of like North Korea, but minus the weird death camps that they have. Because that would be, I mean, that's like kind of, I guess it's not really a genocide, so I guess that's a good example. It doesn't really affect international society, even though it's really messed up, right? Because they're not just executing people, they're working them to death. You know?
So why does it not affect international society?
Well, because they're blocked off from everyone.
Right. So there's no spillover effect? Is that the idea? Right.
Yeah.
Claudia? Anything?
Yeah, I would say, like, I don't like the harm part. Like, I think they do affect the international society. Let's just take the war in Syria at the moment, the civil war, the refugees, with the ISIS and the increased attacks in the world. They do affect us. They don't necessarily, like, if you just look at the refugees, they don't harm us. Like, there's no harm coming from more refugees coming to different parts of the world. But they do affect international society. So for me, it would be like, there would have to be something very bad happen to say it harms international.
Right. Yeah, good. So maybe it can affect things around them, but not always clearly harmful. So that might be a way to doubt it. Jeff's point saying, well, even if something really harmful is going on, it might not spill over. You might contain it within North Korea in this case. Right? And in both cases, presumably, that doesn't make you doubt whether an international crime is going on, right? Like something like a crime against humanity could go on, even if you kept everyone, if you just locked everyone in this hermetically sealed country, or if people started fleeing, but it was actually a neutral or maybe a good thing instead of a harmful thing. Right? Yeah, so there's the same argument. You get the same problem here that we saw the previous argument, right? That's what Altman and Wellman think too. They think, well, maybe, sometimes, sure, right? Sometimes, maybe in the Rwandan case, it did really destabilize parts of northern Congo. Maybe in the Syria case, who knows, right? Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe in other cases, like North Korea, there is just no international dimension to it at all. But none of that really makes you, they think, none of that really gets you to doubt whether there is something like a crime against humanity going on, right? Or whether the genocide is any less bad for that reason. Like remember earlier we said, well, we have 1,000 people just like dying in a year on some type of violence or whatever, and then we have 1,000 people dying in genocide. Well, it's horrible for all these people involved. Equally, they're all dead and wish it would never happen, right? But there seems to be an additional layer, morally speaking, to genocide that leads you to think, well, there's something extra there, such that we call that a crime against humanity, and the 1,000 sort of unconnected deaths we would not call a crime against humanity. So, what's that additional layer? Well, one suggestion, right, was, well, it spills over. It spills over to other boundaries. But say, well, imagine a case where it's not true. Maybe it's Syria, maybe it's North Korea, maybe imagine another case. Do you now think that layer has disappeared, right? Well, if you still think, no, the genocide is still has that extra dimension to it, then that extra dimension is not made up out of spillover. Right? Because that's where we're looking now. We're imagining it away. The extra dimension is still seems to be there. So can't be the spillover effect. It has to be something else. And so that's the argument that they're giving, right? Like imagine if the spillover effect is not there. If you still believe that this is a particularly heinous or terrible thing, something that international society or courts should do something about, then you cannot believe in May's argument, Justice Jackson's argument. Justice Jackson's argument might have done a good job at the time for the law as it was, but morally speaking, if we think about not the way the law was or is, or the way the law should be, then it's a different question, Altman and Wellman claim. So we need something else, right? It's not a crime against everyone, Ullman and Wellman think. It's not because it's aggression across borders. Something else. So any questions so far? Am I going too fast? All right, we're asking this stuff, remember, right? We're asking about why should this change that happened at the Nuremberg trials in international law, why should that be accepted, if at all? We've seen some of the arguments for the old system. That's being replaced with the Nuremberg trials, and these days it has been effectively been replaced. We're asking, like, why is that justifiable ethically? Is that morally something that constitutes progress? Right? Is this the world better now for having these things? If the answer is yes, then you need a good argument, an explanation for why the answer is yes. Why is that better? These are two arguments, right? But Altman and Wellman think they're bad arguments. They don't, not because none of this can ever be true, but it doesn't really get at the heart of what makes that better. All right. So here's their answer, right? So remember, we have the two different questions again. Why do they have a right to punish instead of the sovereignty thing, right? And why do they have the standing to punish? Why do they have the authority to do it, since not everybody has? Right? All right. The first is super simple. You know this, right? This is the standard argument they trot out all over the place. Countries have sovereignty, self-determination, those rights, only if they protect human rights. Well, crimes against humanity are so horrible that it cannot be adequate, right? And so, therefore, any country that allows crimes against humanity does not enjoy the protection of sovereignty and self-determination. And that was what was blocking, right? That was what was raising the question about the right. How come outsiders have a right to punish people in another country? Isn't that a sovereign nation? And their answer is no, because crimes against humanity are so bad that the sovereignty rights are gone. We've seen that time and again, and we'll see it coming more when we talk about intervention. This is the more interesting one. So how come you have the authority? Right? So remember the question, right? Like, so let's say that you commit a crime. You beat someone up, right? Pretty bad crime. I come by, I say, I have seen you beat someone up. You need to be punished. So far, so good, right? And I throw you in my basement for 2 weeks. I say, there's your punishment. 2 weeks of imprisonment in my basement. Water and bread. That wouldn't be good, right? That wouldn't be the right thing for me to do because I don't have the standing. I'm not a judge. I'm not the government, basically. And so the idea is, how come if I don't have the standing, but the government does? How about in these cases where it's not the government itself that's being punished, but it's members of the government being punished? How come that whoever's doing the punishment, how come they have the standing? In Nuremberg, it was just people appointed by other governments. So the Russians, the Americans, the French and the English, they all appointed some judges to the tribunal, jointly in one case. And so those judges together punished members of the German government. But then the question is, well, if those people weren't part of the government, how come they have the standing, right? How come they're not just like me, throwing you in my basement? Well, they wear robes and they pretend they have they look very weighty and they have a gavel and say, well, I could do those things, right? Wouldn't make it any better. Right? There has to be something more there. So what would that be? Well, one answer was the earlier one, the Arendt one. Arendt thinks it's an attack on all of us, and all of us together, appointed these judges. Ullman and Wellman don't buy that. So what's their answer? They give a very simple, so strikingly simple one. Just think it's morally super serious. Right? It's really, really, really bad, these crimes against humanity. And then they think, well, if things are really, really, really bad, extremely serious, then that just the badness makes it of international concern. So it seems that if it's just you beating someone up, that's very serious, right? But it's not very, very, very serious like genocide is. And so if it's just beating someone up, then maybe other governments don't have any standing to come after you. Because it's not bad enough. It's so, like, when we think about it this way, if you just insult someone, right? Pretty bad, gratuitously, right? You insult someone. Who gets to tell you off for this? Well, then I actually get to tell you off. I say, hey, don't be nicer. So maybe then everybody gets to do it. Then there's the more serious stuff where I don't get to do it anymore, but the government has to be. And then there's the really, really serious stuff where the whole world, sort of, or the international community together gets to do it. Something like that layering seems to be going on here. So then there's international concern, and then if there's international concern, then you have the standing answer. Then the international court is the one that's appropriately punishing. This is, if you're going to hold Altman and Wellman to the same standards that they hold others to, you should ask some questions about this, right? The layering idea, is that plausible? I mean, I'm not sure. Is the reason that I can't punish you for beating someone up that it's something more serious than insulting someone? It's weird, right? Like, so the worse things get, the fewer people you have to fear punishment for. That seems kind of perverse. Maybe it just is that I don't get to punish you because there is a safer, more reliable method out there, which is the government. Right? But if it wasn't out there, then maybe I could do it again. Well, internationally, there isn't like a more safe or reliable way to do it than to do it internationally through these courts and so on. So maybe that's the answer. Anyway, that's a different type of argument than just saying it's really bad. So you should ask that for yourself. We've talked about this already. I'm going to go on. All right. Here's one last note about this. This is an important thing just historically. Altman and Wellman don't spend too much time on this. But there is a worry that came up with the Nuremberg problem about ex post punishment. So basically ex post means just after the fact, right? And so it's an additional problem, but it's really important to understand why this whole explosion that we've seen over the last half century or so of international law, international courts, international this, that, and the other, why all that has happened. Right. So, consider the following simple argument. This was the defense that the Nazi officials, they hired lawyers, because they were trial, right? So you hire a lawyer, the lawyer comes up with defense. Here is one of the points of defense. So, if you don't commit a crime, or if you did, like what you did was not a crime, then it's unjust for you to be punished. Right? Simple, pretty plausible principle, right? So it's a no rhetoric. There's a standard idea of the rule of law, right? Like if you at the time didn't commit a crime, you shouldn't be punished. That includes, right, if you do something today and tomorrow the government says that thing is illegal, then the day after tomorrow they can't punish you for doing that today, right? If you do it again in 2 days, then you can be punished for that one. But they can't so they can't say tomorrow cell phones are illegal and then fine us all $1,000 for having a cell phone today. Right? Of course, if you keep your cell phone after the law, then maybe they can, but they can't do it for having a cell phone today. It's just basically unfair, right? You were never told that it was illegal. You never had any chance to adjust your behavior, and still you come to. All right, so here's the second premise. Well, to commit a crime, you must actually break the law. So far, so good, right? Otherwise, it's not the crime. So then, if you didn't actually break the law at the time, right, then it's unjust for you to be punished. So you can see how this will go, right? None of the defendants actually broke any laws, in part because they wrote the laws. Right? They changed the laws to say the law is now that Jewish people have to wear stars, that they won't be able to occupy any of these professions anymore, that they lose their civil rights and so on, that they can be deported, and all these things they were legal. There was a paper trail. But then, right, it seems that it was unjust for the defendants at the Nuremberg trials to be punished. So, here's your defense. This is a court of law, right? Right. Was it against the law? No. Dang, acquitted. Right? That's it. Simple defense. What do you think of this, by the way?
It seems kind of similar to human rights, right? Because nobody's agreed on them totally whole yet, just like the laws. Nobody had established the law yet, like you said, about the cell phones.
Right.
Morals are relative, I guess, right? Like an SS officer thinks he's doing something good, but other people are like, no, you're not, but nobody's really established it yet. So it's hard to.
I'm not sure I'm following what you're saying.
You said, what's the problem with this, right?
Well, do you see? I mean, there's one possible interpretation is to think that it was wrong. The Nuremberg trials that was a sham, right? It's ex post justice. You shouldn't do that.
Right.
It's just like punishing you tomorrow for having a cell phone today. Right?
Right.
If the law against cell phones is passed tomorrow.
That's what I'm saying.
So, do you think this argument? You find this convincing? You think they should have been acquitted?
No. I mean, no. But
I mean, that's where it leads to, right? They say, like, look, it's unjust to punish these people. They were, like, some of them were hung, right? They were killed. They killed them. So.
yeah. But if there's, I mean, was there a law against genocide, ethnic cleansing before World War II?
No. There was no international law against it, and there was no German law against it. So that was the defense, right? He said, like, well,
That's what I'm saying.
to
So
commit a crime, you have to break a law. And
right. If there's no law, then I guess
right.
then they get acquitted, right? If there's no law, you can't break it.
Right. So you find it's hard to get out of this, basically. You might not want to say yes, they were
Yeah,
right,
no,
but
exactly,
right.
because I hate what they did, right? But
Right.
I mean, that's
Right.
solid. I mean, genocide is terrible, but if it was something
Right.
less.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is part of what the Nazi officials themselves said, right? They said, like, hey, guys, you are, if you think it was so horrible, just execute us, right? But don't pretend like this is like don't put us through a criminal trial as if we're like an ordinary thief or anything. That's not the right form. Like, if you think it was so bad, then kill us. There's some honor in that or something, they thought, right? But whatever, it's not like this. Or let us walk, because we didn't do anything illegal. Reggie?
I mean, I don't agree with that because some laws, like you said, are like morally reprehensible. I mean, you said in the law, they changed the law to say that Jews couldn't have certain jobs, everything else. That's like, well, morally reprehensible. You can't change a law to deny a human right for anything, just as far as live. And
yeah, so good. That's really interesting. You say so that you can't really change the law. So let's go through this for a moment. This is it's a good point you're raising. This is a type of argument that people have made against this. And Justice Jackson actually tried a version of this, so that's why I want to take our time. So, when you say that, the argument goes like this, like 1 and 2 lead to the conclusion in 3, right? And this conclusion in 3 plus 4 lead to 5, right? And 5 is the thing that's the bothering thing, right? Even if we don't know how to get out of it, that's like, that's the conclusion. So, if we want to get out of that, we have to deny 4, 2, or 1 of these. So let's go one by one, right? See which one we don't find acceptable. So, but if you did not commit a crime, then it's unjust for you to be punished. That's you. Right. Okay. Good. That's pretty. So now, second, to commit a crime, you must break the law. Is that the one you're thinking about? That's not. Yeah. So what do you say against it?
Because to commit a crime, you must break the law. Say you broke the law, because the crime is you did a human rights violation, a more reprehensible crime as far as taking away people's rights.
Good. So it was a human rights violation, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is 1948. So this is a trial is in 1946 for things that were happening in the early 40s, right? So I'm I'm literally the devil's advocate now, right? So I'm defending these Nazis, right? I'm saying to you, says, well, where's the crime? Like, so where's the law? It's not in the German law books. There's no Universal Declaration of Human Rights or any international law like that yet. So where's what law did I break?
If you were saying you were a sovereign state, wasn't Germany a sovereign state at the time?
Yes. Under
if
international
you were a
law.
sovereign state at the time, in order to be a sovereign state, you got to be able to protect human rights.
Human rights didn't really exist at the time. That's all after. That's why they were created, right? To take this take this answer away from people that they couldn't say that anymore. We'll get to Sydney. And then
I don't know particularly how to answer the question, but I know at the time, there were laws that were automatically set up internationally because that is when the UN was made, like a year before then. So they charged them for a lot of things that weren't relevant with, peace crimes, petty crimes,
Mhm.
but there was a law that they could use, which was war crimes, because they did cross borders
Right.
with it. So to get by this and still respect it, they couldn't charge them for things they didn't like. They could charge them for something kind of thing, which is why war crimes was the only reasonable solution to be able to penalize them for their actions, which is why a lot of people did get away, because they didn't technically fit into that, but a lot of the officials that were associated with the war itself were able to be
Right.
put to trial.
Right, and so that's why we said earlier, right? Jackson says this stuff about, well, the genocide stuff, the Holocaust, and the wars, the aggressive war stuff. They were really, you can't really separate them neatly, right? It's really all part of one big war crime, and that was already against the law, right? Because there was treaty law that goes back all the way to the 1300s, basically, against that. And so now we've got it, right? So there's your law that you broke. But that doesn't fly for everybody, right? Well, at least that's the worry, right? It might not fly for everybody. So Eichmann, for example, even though he was a fugitive at the time, but he was just an ordinary state bureaucrat. He wouldn't have anything to do with the war. And it's not quite clear either, like the Goebbels, right, the propaganda minister, he was there. He killed himself. These guys had like cyanide pills sewn into the hems of their clothing, so they could kill them. It's very bizarre if you read these. There's very interesting books about the Nuremberg trial. They're really interesting to read. They did a lot of interviewing with these people, and they really, as soon as Hitler kills himself, they lose their will to live. They saw him as like literally a messianic figure. They thought of him as a godlike creature. And so once Hitler kills himself, the whole thing has failed. They don't see any point in going to kill themselves. Anyway, but so someone at Goebbels, who was just a propaganda, basically he was in advertising, right? Government advertising is what he did. So for those people, it's pretty hard to connect the war crimes thing.
Which, I mean, that's the way our law still works. I mean, if you find evidence without going with the proper law, unfortunately, evidence doesn't exist anymore. It's just a way that we keep things set up so we can stay as moral and proper as possible, I guess.
Right. So that's part of the work. Now nowadays, as Reggie was pointing out, it's different internationally at least, because we do have an extensive human rights law body, and we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which every country signed up. Right. So no country can hide behind, the UN maybe was created in 1944, but we never joined, so you can't just force us to be. That's illegal, right? So. All that is gone now, right? But this was the reason why that whole thing started happening, right? Why you get and why you still have things like the International Criminal Court being set up, and then people being very worried when some countries don't ratify these type of agreements, because it creates these legal pockets for people to get these type of excuses going. All right, we'll get back to this in a second, Ryan.
I think premise 2 is absurd. It's definitely not the case that you must break the law to commit a crime. Something is not right or wrong because the law says so. Murder is not wrong because there is a law about it. There is a law about it because murder is wrong. The crime itself is antecedent to the law.
Mm-hmm.
So to commit a crime, I mean, that seems pretty self-evident that, because that's what all the law is, saying some things are right and some are wrong. And it's very evident that whether the law says something about some things or not, that they are wrong, completely apart from what people say about it. And if premise 2 is false, then this argument's no good. So.
Good, yeah. So a version of that is what most people, not most people, the version of that is what some people accept, including Justice Jackson. To push back for 1 second, right? Not everything that's wrong, even really wrong, is a crime, right? And it's not just so because it's not yet picked up by the law. So think about, like, say, you cheat on your spouse or something, right? Like a person who's committed themselves to you for 25 years or something, faithful, worked really hard on getting the marriage to work with you, and then you just go out and cheat on them. It's really, really wrong, right? It's a terrible thing to do. You should just not do that. You should be faithful to them as well as they are to you. And so don't mess that up, right? It's a rare, valuable thing that you've got going. Don't do that. It's really wrong. Is it a crime? Well, it's not illegal, right? Should it be illegal? Probably not, right? It's probably a bad idea for the government to go around and literally police people's marriages. So it's strange to say that you commit a crime, anything you do something that's really wrong. It has to be something else. And then the lawyer is going to tell you, well, the other thing is like what? Okay, well, we have a criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is not supposed to just punish things that are wrong. It's supposed to punish things that are against the part of the law that is the criminal law. Now, okay, so Justice Jackson says this, right? Justice Jackson says, fair enough, but there is a higher law. Literally, there's one passage where he says this. He doesn't really put a lot of emphasis on it because there was no legal basis for this or that. But he says there is a higher law. And so he thinks that this sort of this moral wrongs that you're talking about, as long as they're of the right kind, the really bad ones or something, even worse, right? Like killing 40 million Jewish people or something. That's it doesn't get much worse than that, right? So there is a law that he says there's a higher law that's against it. And that's the kind of law that you doesn't have to be written down. Doesn't have to be ratified. Doesn't have to be passed. Doesn't have to be whatever, right? Doesn't have to be put in the law books for it to be a law and for it to be violation of which to be a crime. So Jackson denies it. So if you ever taken a philosophy of law class, there is an old tradition that goes back at least to Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval philosopher. And Aquinas says this, an unjust law is no law at all. And he thinks there is a moral quality here to law. So if the law is unjust, it's just not a law. And the flip side of this would be that something that's really wrong is legally prohibited too. So you can have laws against something even though they haven't actually been written down. It's just because there's the morality. Tesson actually believes this. I've heard him say, he says, it's part of the structure of the universe. It's the law against genocide. Reggie, yeah, you
I
have?
was going to say that even because you said this wasn't in effect before 1945, before this happened, there was no law. But wouldn't it be like, say you got...
No international law against... If Jackson is right, then the law against Holocaust has been with us for eternity, right? So even when there were cavemen, there was this higher law, which is right.
But wouldn't you allow someone to go to when you had the boxes and the slides, as far as like say you got 3 different bodies or states that would say this is wrong, you can't just go and kill 14 million people. So would those 3 come together and say, okay, well this is wrong, so we're going to impose this punishment on this 4th state? Basically the collective world coming against one country.
Yeah.
Could you do it like that? Because you said since that wasn't in effect.
Well, that's what happened, right? Yeah. So you had the Soviets, the Americans, the English, and then the French wanted to be included too. So they all appointed a judge, right? And so that made up the Nuremberg tribunal, and those judges actually punished the military leaders, but also the Nazi officials. But of course, the worry here is like, so. I mean, this is just Victor's. I mean, you can pretend like it's a real criminal court, right? But you and I can do that too, right? Like you and I can come together and then we can snatch up someone here in this room, have a whole staging, right? So look weighty, have days and days of evidence gathering, this and that, hire people, and then in the end just throw them in jail, right? And say justice is served. But most of the time, we'd be the ones in the wrong, right? That would be a sham. Right?
But did
And
they
so,
use a religious?
so is this not just a big version of that? Is the word?
Did they use any type of religion in their justification of this? I mean, because
No, not really.
If you want to go to like the beginning law, thou shalt not kill. I mean, that's Christianity law, but it might be a certain law for Jewish, Buddhist, something like that, as far as not killing.
Right. Yeah, no, they didn't appeal to that much. I mean, the Hobbesian argument that you referred to with the matrix with these boxes would tell you that would be a very dangerous path to travel, right? Because different countries have their own religions, and even if they have the same religion, they might have different interpretations of their religion, and so you get all sorts of conflicts between these things before you know, right? So, oh, you're just imposing your religion on us? Right. That's not justice, and so on and so on. So that's part of the answer, right? Like, so if you're going to avoid the worry that this might spiral out of control, you better be doing something more than just after the fact punishing people because you're upset or something. Right? You better have some type of real justification going on. Yes, I thought I saw a hand a moment ago. So, here's the other possible answer, right? You might think that the first one is actually false. So if you did not commit a crime, then it's unjust for you to be punished. You might think that to commit a crime, you really have to break the law, like 2 says, but that it's not necessary to break the law for it to be okay for you to be punished. So maybe there is something just so bad, even though the law doesn't prevent it, such that because you did something really bad, you can be punished. Right? So you deserve it or something. So caveman times, right? One caveman comes over, rapes another cave woman. Right? There is no law yet because it's caveman times. Now, is it wrong to punish this caveman, this rapist caveman? Right? Well, probably not. Right? Terrible individual who, even though he's a caveman, should know better. And so why can he be punished? Well, because of what he did was really wrong, and maybe he deserves to be punished because of the bad thing that he did. So that might be justified, right? Or maybe there's another thing. Maybe because punishment was necessary to do justice to the victims. Right? Maybe to make the victims whole. This is another argument that people have raised. Arendt makes suggests a version of this. Like to make the victims whole, to really have the victims, the Jews that survived and so on, to have them elevated and really respected as human beings again, we have to do something bad to the people who denigrated and humiliated and hurt them so much. It's a possibility. Or maybe it was necessary for Germany to return to peace and the rule of law. For other countries to accept the Germans again, the leaders had to be punished. So there might well be arguments for why you might think, even though no crime was committed, because they changed the laws to fit their own actions, right? It might still be the right thing to do. Or you might think 4, right? You might think, well, this is the Justice Jackson type argument. You can do that either to say you don't have to break an actual law to commit a crime, or you can just say, well, they had broken a law, it's just this higher law that they broke. Right? That's what the psalm would say. Allman and Wellman don't get into much detail here, but looks like what they would say is something like this first premise is false, actually. So even though we agreed on it earlier, it looked pretty clear-cut. Once you step back and you think really, there might be other good grounds for punishment, especially when things get really, really bad. All right. Any questions about this? All right. So just keep in mind, this is a sort of part of the historical background. This type of argument, which was actually made and people really wrestled with it, is why you get this proliferation of international criminal bodies, law, human rights law. This is why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights gets made. So the idea is to have now this higher law that's not just something that Justice Jackson claims is out there, but we can never find it. Right? Or what the Psalm says, it's part of the structure of the universe. Somehow, not visible through a telescope, but somehow. Right? But it's actually out there. There's an actual body that says, here's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and there are the enumerated rights, and you violated number 14 or whatever. Now, if that's true, and if that's a valid part of the law, then actually you can just simply deny number 4, right? You say, well, none of the defendants had broken any domestic laws or German laws, but that's not the only law there is, right? There is international law as well, and they violated. You could say that then. Or you couldn't say it at the time of Germany, but you can say it at the time today. Right? So, guy from Sudan, Bashir, gets put on trial, let's say. He says, but I didn't violate any law. He says, well, no Sudanese law, but yes, you violated international law, and there's your punishment. But at Nuremberg, this was a real problem. All right. All right, so catching up a little bit, not too much. So we got 15 more minutes, so we'll start getting on what we were supposed to talk about today. So it's mostly about sovereignty and intervention. So here's Altman and Wellman's ideas about international criminal law, right? So here's the standard argument. States have a right to self-determination and sovereignty only if and only if they adequately protect human rights. And they give various arguments for this, right? They have this parent-child analogy. The parent only has the authority to raise the child if they do a decent job. Right? If they do a really crappy job, then you can interfere, take away the kid from the parents. But if they do a decent job, then you don't have a right to interfere. There's this functionalist argument and the intuitions behind Nuremberg. This all, they think, points in the same direction, the truth of their view. And you see this, well, if a state commits or allows these crimes against humanity, then it doesn't adequately do that, and then therefore those states don't have the right to self-determination. And so if that's okay to allow international criminal law, it also opens the door to foreign military intervention, and by extension, although we don't get to that today, assassination perhaps. For this reason, right? So states have a right against interference with the self-regarding affairs if and only if they have a right to self-determination. That's the US-Canada example. And so a state that allows or commits crimes against humanity doesn't have a right against interference with the self-regarding affairs. Okay? So if you don't have that right, then in principle intervention could be done. All right. So this is a question we'll get back to, whether that only applies to outsiders or whether there's a different idea about insiders. If you remember from Michael Walzer thinks citizens get the right to overthrow their government way before outsiders do. It seems that Altman and Wellman might have a different view here, because they think outsiders can do it pretty soon as well. All right, so there was a consensus view that Altman and Wellman attack. The consensus view is more or less the view that international law represents today. So in international law, there is this doctrine called the responsibility to protect. So the United Nations have accepted this, endorsed this document that was drafted about a decade ago. And the document is called the responsibility to protect. And that's to replace the old, absolute, like non-interventionist view of international law, where international law says states really cannot attack other states unless there is some type of aggression going on. And that's been replaced now with this idea that actually other states also have a responsibility to protect the people when some very severe crimes against humanity are going on. So legally now it can be justified for countries to attack other countries when there is a genocide, or there is a big-time civil war going on, or some other kinds of horrible oppression and violence, and there is a motion from the Security Council, right? So they have to get some type of authority behind it. So. But then, countries can just straight out attack other countries without themselves then being the aggressor, right? Before, if you were an attacker, that meant that you were the aggressor. Other countries could fight against you. You might even be put to trial afterward. But that's now if you're in intervention cases, something bad's going on, the Security Council passes the right type of motion, and then you can attack. Like is going on in Syria now. Right? So in Syria, Russia, mostly it's Russia, but also the United States, they've been attacking for months. Airstrikes and the like are being conducted in actions that would normally be acts of war. But now they're not, supposedly because of the bad, that's at least the legal case, because of the bad stuff that's going on, the violence in Syria, and it has the right type of international approval. All right. But only when things get really, really bad, Syria level bad. If things don't get Syria level bad, but they get still pretty crappy, like in many, like probably a third or maybe half of the world is not a great place to live. There's civil unrest, there is oppression, there's just denial of freedoms, there are dictatorships, whatever, right? You live there cannot be any outside intervention. And that's the consensus. And so that's the thing that Altman and Wellman think is wrong. So think of a place like Cuba or something, right? Cuba is pretty much not a democracy. Lots of people's rights are being denied. But it's not a place in which there's large-scale genocide going on or something. under current international law, Cuba has a right against intervention by the U.S. Like if the U.S. sends in its military and says we're going to set these people free, that's illegal. Just like, what is it now, 15, 16 years ago when the U.S. went into, 2003, so 13 years ago, went into Iraq, right? Saddam Hussein was, like, he was a comically bad tyrant, like he was a terrible person. He was the kind of person that when these kind of spoof movies were made, naked gun type spoof movies, if that means anything to you, they put Saddam Hussein as sort of the cartoon version of a horrible military dictator, right? So people were just randomly put in prison. His sons would just torture folks at random. The soccer team, national soccer team, hadn't done correctly. They just disappear for 14 weeks and get beaten up by it. Like that stuff actually happened, right? Someone wrote, if you didn't really have blogs at that time, but if you did, like today, if you wrote a tweet or something right over a blog again, like Saddam Hussein is a jerk or whatever, you would disappear for weeks. You might get tortured. Maybe we'll see you again. Maybe you, like that kind of stuff was happening regularly. He used chemical weapons against his own people a decade earlier. The only time I believe that has ever happened. Fought aggressive wars, horrific. So the U.S. goes in, overthrows him. It's just gone. Tries to transition the country to democracy. The standard view among international lawyers is that it was illegal. There were some questions about how you interpret the exact legal framework, but the standard view is that it was an illegal act. So the U.S. violated international law by doing that. Altman and Wellman think that's wrong. That's the consent. That's the part of the consensus they want to overthrow. They don't think that should be illegal, or maybe at least it's not morally against the rights of the country of Iraq. Right. Yeah. Jeff.
What if most of the Iraqis I've talked to prefer life under Saddam than life after Saddam because of how bad things got there with the sectarian violence? So would that have any, because it's the people of the country, not the government, the Ba'ath Party obviously wanted to keep Saddam because that was, life was good.
Yeah, bread and butter, yeah.
Yeah.
Saddam wanted to keep Saddam too, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I never talked to him, but I think he might have. So would that have played any part in whether or not it's illegal, whether or not it's looked at as immoral? Even if the population didn't know it at the time, but found out later.
You mean what their wishes were? You mean, or how badly it turned out?
Became, right. So when we walked in 2003, they were like, "Screw that guy, yeah, all right." And then everything got really messed up really quick. And then, do you think the fact that the Iraqi people they liked it under Saddam more than they like it now? Do you think that plays a part in whether or not it's immoral or illegal?
So that's complicated. Yeah. So it's complicated in part because it's not quite clear what the role of the consent of the people might play here, right? So if you remember, like Altman and Wellman think, well, if the people choose to abolish democracy, that's okay, right? But they cannot choose to just abolish the human rights. Okay? So Saddam Hussein was a terrible human rights violating dictator. So if the people say, well, I was quite happy under that wouldn't really matter to them because, well, you don't get to choose that for other people, basically, right? Who are the ones that most of those people probably weren't the actual tortured ones, right? Right. So you can't just choose on behalf of the people who are actually being tortured that it's better. So that's one thing to say. The other thing is, like, on their theory, they call it this two-pronged approach. Just basically means just two halves to it, right? So the first half is, does a country have a right against invasion or intervention? And the answer to that question may be yes or no. Right? If the answer is yes, like Canada has a right against intervention on their theory. Then can there be intervention? No, right? We know immediately intervention is off the table because they have a right against it. But if the answer is no, that, like Iraq, right, in their theory, was not going to be protected by sovereignty or self-determination. So does it have a right against intervention? No, because it doesn't have a right to self-determination. Okay, now the second level comes in. And the second level is this going to be a good idea, right? So can we actually do more good than harm by doing this? or a lot more good than harm, maybe. And if the answer there is no, right, there might be that Iraq didn't have a right against intervention, but it wasn't within our power to make it a better place. Then on their theory, you still shouldn't do it. So one thing that might be is that these things that these people are telling you, they tell you, well, we preferred it before, is evidence that actually things have become worse. And if you knew that, then you shouldn't have done it. But not because there was sovereignty or self-determination involved, just because you shouldn't make things worse if you can avoid it. Right? So that's important for them to keep these things apart. This one is, do they have a right against intervention? And if yes, we'll end the story. If no, now we have to still ask a further question, which is this a good idea or not? So think about it this way. If I cut you open and I start rearranging your organs, right? Like I violate your rights. Right? Now you have a right that I don't cut you. But if I'm a surgeon and you sign a consent form, right, then if I ask, does he have a right that I don't cut him? No, because you've given up that right. Right? Voluntarily in this case. So then I can cut you open, right? But now I still have to ask myself, like, will I actually make him better by this, or will I make it worse? If I don't know what I'm doing, I'm not a surgeon, I've just convinced you that I'm a surgeon, you signed your waiver, and maybe you have no right that I don't open you, but I shouldn't do it because I'm going to make you more sick than you already are. Or if a surgeon is going to do a procedure that won't actually be related to the disease or something, right? You just cut out your intestine or something. Right? That's not a good idea, even though you might not be violating your rights, because you said, do whatever you think, doc, right? Okay. And so it's the same thing, right? So it's not that I'm violating your rights, it's just that I'm messing things up, and that's a bad idea. Okay. All right. So, but the consensus view is about that first level, is that do countries have a right against it or not? Because that's what international law is talking about. Right? And that's the thing they want to resist. So, why might there be this type of consensus view? So why is there a prohibition against intervention? Why is there a right against intervention for states unless there is severe humanitarian emergencies? So they discuss two arguments. One is the sovereignty and self-determination argument, the old one that we've seen many times. The second is by risk avoidance, like actions that impose risks can also violate human rights. Quickly, this first one you know now, right? You've seen it a million times. States have a right to self-determination if and only if they adequately protect human rights. We know that. But there is a difference between the space between the supreme humanitarian emergencies, the severe ones that the consensus view talks about. On the one hand, that's the worst. And on the other hand, there is what they call adequately respecting human rights. And that doesn't require, like you don't get up to the level of adequate by just not being horrifically bad. Right? So the idea is horrifically bad is a bar that's here, adequate is a bar that's here, and you need to be on top of this, they think, to have a right against intervention. And the current consensus view allows all these countries that fall in between the horrifically bad and the adequate part to be protected, while they have no right to be protected. That's the basic theory. You see how this goes? All right. So, let me see. Is there? Oh, yeah. So, back to your question. Altman and Wellman talk about this consent of the people question, right? Like so. The people in some theories think that if the people invite intervention, then it's okay. Walzer thinks this, for example. If the people of Libya ask the Swedes to intervene, then it's okay. But if they don't, then it's not okay. And Altman and Wellman think that's mistaken. The consent of the people doesn't really play a role. And it's because of the human rights role. That's really, they think, doing all the work here. But you should think about that. All right, any questions? Well, we're catching up. We're not quite there yet, but the rest we'll do next week, and I'll post reading questions as an assignment shortly. Have a good week.